to buck the trend, because I'm not talking about my PhD research, but this is part of a bigger project where it involved my doing a critical discourse analysis of Asian women's magazines, and I was looking at the concept of beauty and skin whitening within those magazines. So these are not just gratuitous. I just wanted to give you a very quick insight into the kinds of texts that I was working with. There was a particular magazine, Asiana, which is a British publication. It's aimed at women in Britain. And I just thought it was the subject position that they construct for readers was quite an interesting one, because it's a kind of cultural hybrid where they are recognising that the women often have been born in Britain. They might be second and even third generation, but also having allusions to their ancestral heritage in Asia. So this isn't a patronising image. It was actually from one of the magazines, you know, so they talk about India. This is actually a street in Blackburn, and these are the kinds of images of beauty. Lightnex is one of the prominent skin lightening creams that have been plugged in the magazines. So the focus is on the ethnographic data produced through focus group discussions, where I was using magazines as a stimulus to generate discussion with readers of magazines. And as I said earlier, my aim was to try and ascertain the subject positions, whether they were the ideal reader, whether they engaged with the messages problematically, or whether they resisted those messages. So the objective, you can see there, is to carry out focus group discussions. When David first had the idea for these masterclasses, he sent out a list of different expertise areas, and it was tempting to tick along, but I attended one of the sessions on poststructuralism a couple of weeks ago, but my research is underpinned by poststructuralism. A key tenet of poststructuralism is that our subjectivity is socially constitutive and in a constant state of flux. So as I say, I wanted to try to establish whether the women who engage with these magazines did so in the way that the text producers intended. But my understanding was really in terms of what they made of the beauty, the ideological messages around beauty, and this conception that to be beautiful you had to be white. Unchallengingly so in these magazines. But I wanted to look at whether the readers actually engage with that. So this is an ethnographic study. So the origins of ethnography, as far as I'm aware, began in the 20th century in socio-cultural anthropology. And one of the lead figures that we read about in language and linguistics text is Malinowski, who said that the goal of social science research is to understand how the behaviour of observed within a community is linked to the beliefs and interpretive practices characteristic of that group. However, he also argues that scientific analysis of behaviour requires more than simply trying to see the world through an informant's eyes. In other words, it's about generating a theory of social behaviour that's based on both an insider and an outsider perspective. In linguistics we call this the emic and the etic, but the difficulty lies in the balance between the two, the insider and the outsider. So clearly I was an outsider in this research community. So I wasn't sure what people were expecting from this session, whether it's a how-to or whether it's about, what I actually found from the focus group discussion. So I've hedged my bets and I've done a little bit of both. So I'm going to talk a little bit about planning ethnographic field work. In other words, what are the stages that help us to get to that insider or that the insight that's needed when conducting ethnographic field work? Well, all research requires advanced planning. I'm sure you agree with that one. So the first thing to consider is what is the focus. So ethnography tends to adopt an inductive, data-driven, bottom-up approach. So you may have some well-defined research questions, but my experience is that they start to shift as you gather the data, and that's not necessarily a problem. Just to give you an example, one of the focus groups that I conducted, it was around skin whitening. So the questions that I led with were to get women to talk about skin whitening, and for some reason or another, they started to talk about hijab wearing, and it really generated some interesting data that I was able to use in another way. So I'm just pointing to the fact that things might shift. So just to another difficulty is, are you able to access the population of speakers? And if so, are there going to be cultural sensitivities that need to be observed? And also your position as a researcher, how will the research participants relate to you? How do they see you? Aaron talked before about establishing a rapport, and I do agree with that. It's very important, or certainly in terms of the groups that I've been working with. So the women involved in the focus groups belong to the South Asian population of Lancashire, and I've given you the demographics, so I didn't have to look too hard to find women who belong to the community of speakers. So I identified a bounded and internally cohesive group of speakers who I was able to interact with on a fairly regular basis. I would have at least 3 meetings, one to explain about the project and get to know the people before I launch in with the focus group and get them to cooperate with me. And I'd also have a reporting back, or a checking back, if you like, that I haven't misrepresented they're not misrepresented. So, as I said, it's also important to bear in mind cultural sensitivities. I'll just tell you about one faux pas. I wanted to thank the women involved for giving up the time being part of the project, and I took in some chocolates without thinking about the fact that they might contain alcohol, which you can imagine caused some consternation in a group where some of the women were Muslims. So it's just that thinking through and not launching and making such problems. So, as I said also, it's how your informants relate to you. So, social positioning, how are you introduced to the group? Might they see you as an expert and them as novices? Might race or sex or sexuality be an issue? Social class, nationality. So the focus group discussion where I'm going to talk about the data today was, these were members of Lancashire Women's Network. So this is a group, a charitable organisation that works primarily but not exclusively with women from black and minority ethnic backgrounds. So it started in about 1998, and the claim is that during the time they've been in operation, they have empowered thousands of women from across Lancashire in training programmes, personal development opportunities, and helping them to get into employment. So the question is, how could I, as I've put down white and blonde but grey now, grey-haired, blue-eyed woman, what place did I have in trying to understand the meaning of whiteness within that culture? So it does disrupt that notion that I could be a true insider within that community. So just a little bit of background, because again, when you start on the project, you have to do your research and find out what's been written about these communities that you're investigating. So according to Green, Meredith et al., whiteness is multifaceted, situationally specific, and reinscribed around changing meanings of race in society. The meaning of whiteness varies in relation to context, history, gender, class, sexuality, region, and political philosophy. So you can see that whiteness is subject to a multitude of meanings, but I'm interested in what it means for the women in this particular community. But in challenging understandings of whiteness, it's important to critique notions of Western representations of the other, to try and see how, that might impact on the identity construction of Asian women as the other, and, how that impacts or manifests in the magazines. So it's important, as I said earlier, to talk informally with the group without giving too much away about the project, because if you launch in and say this is, what I'm hoping to achieve, then there might be researcher acquiescence, where the participants are trying to even second guess what it is you're looking for, and particularly if they like you, and why wouldn't they, joke, they'd be wanting to help you to achieve your research goals. Also, because I've carried out my own prior textual analysis, there was a danger that there might be some preconceptions. So I had to kind of leave those to one side and focus more on the community dynamics. So I had got some semi-structured questions that would begin the discussion, but I don't know how much you know about focus groups, but the whole rationale behind them is that it's the dynamic within the group that is of interest, where people might build on each other's contributions, or they might engage with contributions in not a challenging way, I hope, because what is always uppermost in my mind, certainly with focus groups, is to try and make sure that they are a non-threatening environment where people can say what they truly think without risk of being pulled up on that. So semi-structured questions just as a backup. Magazines to stimulate the discussion, so women could flick through magazines and stop wherever they thought there was something of interest. I audio recorded the discussions because it would be incredibly difficult to capture them in another way. But we have the observer's paradox. I don't know if you're familiar with the observer's paradox, but in language study, it really is a paradox in that people, when they know they're being recorded, unconsciously alter the behaviour. So if you're looking for naturalistic speech, which we usually are, then you're never going to get it. So recognising that, what sociolinguists do is to try and make the recording as unobtrusive as possible. But you need something robust enough to pick up speakers, but not something that will take up too much space and keep reminding people that they're being recorded. So gaining access to the community can happen in a number of ways, but the friend of a friend technique is usually a good one, because you don't go in as a complete stranger then, and people who are not familiar with you won't treat you as a complete stranger if you have the backing of somebody that they do know. So let's just move on to the next slide. So why was it that this particular community was of interest? Well, according to Glenn, regardless of the origins of colour consciousness in India, the preference for light skin seems almost universal today. And in terms of sheer numbers, India and the Indian diasporic community, which is the community I was working with in Lancashire, constitute the largest market for skin lightness. And the major consumers of these products in South Asian communities are women between the ages of 16 and 35. So my women, the youngest was around 22, I think, and the oldest about 45. So they are within that group. So I was interested in this community because it's shown by research that skin colour is a preoccupation, and I thought it would be a good one for discussion. So as I said, I was introduced as a friend of a friend, but I do feel that as a researcher, when you're asking people to give up their time to talk to you, even though they might find it enjoyable, and usually the women said that they had found it enjoyable, it's incumbent to give something back. And I was fortunate enough to get some money, a small grant from the Leave a Human Trust that enabled me to give £10 gift vouchers to the women concerned. Just from a practical point of view, I also kept field notes to record things like who was sitting next to whom, because that might have been important to the group dynamics, the layout of the room, and social characteristics. For example, when that discussion broke out about the hijab, it was interesting to know which women were actually wearing a hijab at the time. Emotional responses can also be important. So these are things that could go down in the field note diary. And it helps you, again, Erin mentioned about cross-referencing and keeping careful records, making sure that she was talking about photographs, being numbered, that kind of thing. So making sure that tapes of discussions carried out on particular days at particular locations. Also giving a reassurance to participants that the recordings are just for my purposes. People might be less inclined to contribute if they think it's going to be, the data's going to be listened to more widely. And you've got the ethical concerns there. So I do talk a little bit about using a broker. Is this a concept that you're familiar with? In other projects I've used a broker. This would be maybe a youth worker who's engaged in the community, or teachers who might introduce me to a group of mothers who meet within the school. So guaranteeing confidentiality. I usually ask women to give me pseudonyms so that if I do publish the findings and they want to read they can identify themselves, so they know which pseudonym I've given them. Collecting cultural artefacts as well. It's interesting that you should mention cultural artefacts too. The magazines I'm actually treating as cultural artefacts, but obviously nothing takes place in a vacuum, and the women actually told me that they do read magazines, but they don't buy them. In other words, they read them in doctors' waiting rooms or dentist surgeries. But they did read another magazine, a local newspaper called Asian Image. So I got some of those to have a look at how they compared, because the women were saying that although it's a local newsletter kind of publication, it did talk about skin lightening and those kinds of issues. So how do you know when to leave the field? A well-known sociolinguist, Don Kulik, talks about you know when to leave the field when you know the answers or the responses that your community will give you before you've even asked those questions. So, following up and writing up the project, what essentially I was looking for was identifying particular themes and patterns. So it means reading through carefully, not once but several times, and identifying common themes. But in the writing up, is it written as a narrative? Does it tell a story about the community in question? Would it help somebody who's not familiar with that community to have a better understanding? So quite a bit of the writing up of the data that I gather is in the form of vignettes, little scenarios or stories of what's happened. Quotations, I often try to just leave the women's words as they were given, not trying to tidy them up in any way, that kind of idea. So all of this with a view to giving support to the claims that I'm making about data. So that's enough about the process. Shall we have a look at some data now? So this is one of the women at Lancashire Women's Network, and it's interesting that they're talking about a contradiction. In the Asian women's magazines, whiteness is privileged, and it's underpinned by the revenue of sales for skin lightening cream. But Naz is pointing out that in English culture, brown skin is actually desirable. She goes on to relate the importance in terms of but whiteness in terms of the caste system in India, that the higher the caste, the lighter the skin, because those people don't have to work in the fields and don't attract the skin, the tan. Other insights into the culture are looking at this kind of image. This was from a bridal article. We have Amy saying, you know what's really strange? I'm looking at this and it's a wedding magazine, and then I think about how many Asian weddings I've been to where there's very pretty girls that have darker skin, and on the wedding day, and Naz, this shows you how it's very collaborative, says they look like ghosts. And Amy carries on, yeah, they look like ghosts, the neck doesn't match their face, and it's really sad they've done that, they're so pale. But it does tell us that fairness, if you're expected to make a good marriage match, is something that's expected within that culture. So the issues around skin lightening have come up in Asiana as an issue, that it could be problematic. So alongside this, there's a discourse of empowerment for the women readers. The idea that you can actually change your skin to fit in or to be empowered. But the young women talk about that actually it just creates more anxieties, the fact that it is possible to change. So seeing these images, I was saying this yesterday when you came in, there's plastic surgery in these creams and it's making girls think, oh, I can be like that, I can be a fair-skinned girl, you can be perfect, you can have surgical procedures, but I don't think, girls would be as bothered if they didn't have all these images that are constantly telling them these messages. They're saying basically that it promotes further anxieties. So talking about, I said my interest was this strange cultural hybrid where on the one hand the women are referred to as British and on the other as Asian. When they do talk about the Asian ancestry, it can be quite a critical way that, they're more sophisticated now or they know better. And Naz talks about where our families in Pakistan, they speak Pashto, and they're very strict in the way they behave. And they look at certain cultural practices in rather a critical way there, talking about bride selling, for example, which is still practiced. I mean, it sounds horrible, but what they used to do, if you had a daughter, if you wanted to sell her off, she'd be weighed, and the weight would put the value down. So it's kind of tapping into some of the ideological messages in a critical way. So I want to talk next about what Agar refers to as the rich points. It's a little bit like what you were alluding to with the not said of the text, but how do you know that something is important? These are the gaps in understanding that inevitably occur when you're not familiar with the culture. So these are the unexpected events. So Jay is experiencing racism from within her own culture. This is something that surprised me. She says, in Haslingden, where I live, most of the people that live there are Bengali or Pakistani. A few members of my family who are obviously from Afghanistan. But because I was different to the Pakistanis there, I was bullied a lot, so this is looking at the wider Asian community and difficulties within that. And they used to call me Gori, which means white girl in their language. So even though I was from the Asian kind of culture and my family migrated to Pakistan, I was still different. I was bullied so much because of the way I looked. I was really pale, and the language that I spoke. And Naz comes in with, you're always trying to get a tan, aren't you? So it really struck me as, who does Jay mean by they? I could say when I was in school they used to call me Gilly Bob, which they did actually, but there I mean my peers. They I'm referring to as my peers. But here it does seem to Jay that they are representing the others. There's also a hedge there from the Asian kind of culture, not the Asian culture, but the Asian kind of culture. So again, clearly she's seeing herself as on the outside. And then it does become socially meaningful because Naz chips in. You're always trying to get a tan, aren't you? In other words, you confirm that she doesn't like to be pale skin and different. So I'll just talk about a couple more examples here. So again, this acknowledgement about this hybrid cultural identity. And many of the images and texts in the magazines, they are multimodal, but they often are harking back to a kind of colonial past. You know, this idealised construct. But Amy says, do you think they're saying that not we, but the Asian community still back a decade? Is that why it's there? I don't know. You know, so quite often it was confirming what my own analysis had established, that there were some dodgy, if you like, ideological constructs, but the women did seem to be adopting a subject position that was as a critical leader. So on the one hand, that would occur. Then others, this is why I'm calling it multivocal expressions of identity. It's very difficult to represent every single voice, just to say that there were different voices. But here we've got Jay, who says, she's dark, but she's pretty. Now, but introduces an adversarial clause. It does suggest that what has been said previously is going to be revised in some way. And Amy says, yeah, this is just an article. She's not a model, really. She's doing a makeover. And Jay says, still pretty, though. And in another extract, Naz says, I know loads of guys who's married Bengali girls, who've married darker girls. You know, their parents have thought, oh God, he's married someone who's darker. But, so we've got this adversative clause in again, but they're beautiful girls. So there was a kind of connection between the beauty and the skin lightening debate. The young women had experienced discrimination even from within their own family, where mother-in-laws were disappointed with their son's choice because they were darker skinned, that kind of experience. So just the last couple of slides now. We haven't considered yet the potential of ethnography for impact. You know, this is big on the agenda. But the focus groups discussions in several areas of Lancashire. I did a dissemination workshop, largely driven by having achieved a Lever Hume grant, and that was one of the conditions. But it wasn't a chore to do this because it brought together people who work within the community. It brought together the women who'd taken part in the groups with media representatives in a discussion around some of the findings. I was interviewed by BBC Radio Manchester and Lancashire, and there was a phone-in afterwards. It will comprise a chapter in the book I'm writing on South Asian women's magazines. And I did an interesting cross-cultural comparison, which I presented at a conference in Bangalore. I collected some data when I was on an earlier visit to Bangalore. So there was some interesting cross-cultural comparisons. But just to conclude, and the tea's arrived, I think it would be a tall claim to suggest that the focus group discussions had a role to play in re-education, which is something that Glenn suggests around that skin lightening debate. A proposed solution is re-education that stresses the diversity of types of beauty and desirability, that valorises darker skin shades so that whiteness is dislodged as the dominant standard. But giving women the space to, in a non-threatening environment, to articulate their concerns, I think, probably was something that was worth achieving. So yeah, the only thing I would add that I haven't said so far is maintaining that respect for your participants and trying to ensure that you represent them in accurate ways, or ways that they would wish to be represented.
I don't know how to express my feelings right now about your presentation, but I'm so inspired by every single word you said, because for me it's applicable to me in so many aspects. For instance, it has gender aspect in it, and I'm a woman. It has a race or identity issue, and for instance, I'm from Turkey, but for my country, I can be called as a white Turk. But here, I'm an international student. Although I'm not so dark, maybe in terms of the skin color, still I'm brown. So I haven't experienced any discrimination or racism, but I can be a subject to that. Also, I am a PhD student. I'm actually Dr. Lundy's PhD student, and I'm also working on identity. British Muslims, though, without separating their ethnicity. So it was so interesting in every aspect. I don't have any particular question, to be honest, but it reminded me of so many different things. But the most striking part of your presentation and your research, I think, is the issue of whiteness. Because I guess after, hopefully, my research, my PhD, I'm going to focus on more whiteness as an issue. Because even in your case, you are still asking your questions to Asian British. You are not asking your question to the, let's say, white British, how they see the whiteness as the white people in a white community, and how they also make a separation between whiteness and other colors or races or ethnicities. Because when you still ask this question to the minority group, and when you conduct so many dissemination endeavors, it's still, for me, it's another way of reproduction of the main discourse, because you are talking about, look, these people also try to be as white as possible, because this is also valued in their culture. They can be even victimized by racism in their own culture. And when you glorify the diversity of types of beauty and desirability, still intrinsically, I guess, it creates another signification through language. You give another, maybe discourse to the wider society, even though you try to promote the opposite way. So maybe as a question, I can turn this into a question and ask you, how do you see the issue of whiteness in the wider British society? We were in the States last week in a congress, and there were two presentations about whiteness issue, although they were not completely relevant to that. Especially in one of them, the presenter was talking about a specific course or module, we can call it here, in a university in America. It was called The Problem of Whiteness, and blah blah blah, and it appealed to many criticism and portrayal in media, and it appealed to many comments from the society about, oh, if you have a problem of being white, then leave the country or deal with it. So I'm so interested in whiteness in terms of the perception of whiteness by the white people
Yeah, well, just to go back to that starting point where you're talking about why Asian women rather than white groups, it's more driven by the fact that they are the target audience for this magazine, and it was kind of a complementarity to my own CDA analysis that I wanted to establish whether readers were taking as axiomatic the messages that the producers were giving. But one thing I wasn't able to talk about, which is kind of everything that underpins the work that I do, is the fact that magazines are treated as fairly innocuous text. As I said, women pick them up in a doctor's waiting room. You don't normally engage with that kind of material critically. They're quite lightweight, and I think that's quite dangerous in a way, because you just who knows what effect that they're having. But the other one is that they are commercial, they are underpinned, and it's the commodification of products within magazines that I'm interested in. The fact that all the images of women that are perceived to be beautiful are pale-skinned, and then you look at the vast number of skin whitening advertisements. But I don't know if you know much about the commercial side of magazines, but although they're quite costly, they're £4.50 on average to buy, it barely pays for the paper that they're printed on. The real revenue comes from the sale of advertisements, and that gives advertisers a very powerful voice. They do have a say in what goes in terms of the articles, features, and just the ethos of the magazine. So, yeah.
I'm really interested as well in one of the first quotations you put up from your participants was them talking about the historical origins of this in the caste system. Is that, I suppose that there's an interesting relationship there between something that's a commercial product, really. You're talking about skin whitening as something that's being sold through these images of these light-skinned women. Is that, I suppose I'm always quite interested in the rationales that people give for the continuing power of something like skin lightening. And I suppose I'm just interested in how those two discourses kind of play together, the historical one and the contemporary kind of.
Yeah, well, you're kind of touching on another thing, another aspect of what I'm working on at the moment. I mentioned that I was doing cross-cultural comparisons. I'm looking at a magazine called Femina that's produced in India for Indian women, and it has quite a commodified form of feminism, one that's recognising that you can't talk to women now as though they're complete idiots, that they have achieved a certain level of equality. But I say particularly it's a commodified feminism, because it's still around selling goods, and to be a successful woman you have to look a particular way. But the reason I mentioned Femina is it's linked to the Miss India beauty competition, and it's kind of presenting that as a form of empowerment. But it's producing a particular construct of Indian womanhood, one that's got to appeal on a global stage. If you look at people like Aishwarya Rai, who is a former Miss India, she's a very lucrative prospect, and it does in India challenge the notions. It doesn't challenge the caste system, but there's a neoliberalism that's emerging, with the Indian economy that is creating particular constructs of view.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I could relate with most of the things that you said because I was one of the people who would go in under an umbrella in Sri Lanka and put lightning cranes and not really knowing what it is because its fairness is what's considered beautiful and that's what you want to kind of read. So I'm just wondering in your work, I don't know whether you kind of had a chance to talk with male perceptions of beauty, Asian beauty, and you talk about empowerment. And in your analysis of these magazines, like you showed a picture of a bride and beauty, but you saw something related to kind of reinforcing the reproductive sphere, or kind of into marriage and kind of beauty to get a husband to go into that. Do you see that kind of thing appearing?
Yeah, that image actually, I did write a paper, it should be coming out in Media and Religion, because it was part of a piece on the bridal hijab. So my paper is Undercover Beauty, co-modification of the hijab, because I mean the women that talked about it in the focus group, culturally, they were very offended by the representation of the hijab, almost as though it's a fashion accessory. And the way it talked, my analysis is that it privileges male needs. You know, it talks about how even though you're wearing the hijab, you should still have your hair done because the most important person in the world is going to be seeing it at the end of the day. You know, so it's prioritising or privileging males. So that's just one of the many ideological constructs.
And what about caste? And recently I was discussing this with someone and someone told me if you want to see, because caste is, I mean in India you can hear about caste system still playing out, but in Sri Lanka it's not visible. It's one of the invisible things. And they said if you want to see it, you would have the marriage proposal sections in the magazines and newspapers, and you see class appearing in choice of a caste appearing in choice of marriage partners. So this I guess.
Sorry, Lynn, I was just going to highlight there's a good comparison with Far Eastern magazines as well. So magazines like Hong Kong and men's and women's magazines, there is this sort of ideal towards a more sort of Caucasian looking model. So a lot of the models in those sorts of magazines, they may be Eurasian, or even if they are Asian, they'll have narrower noses, bright bigger eyes, to head towards that sort of ideal Caucasian sort of look.
Yeah.
So it's quite fascinating.
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on with that. There is a rise of Eurasian models for the reasons that you've said. But I think in terms of the messages there, it's even more pernicious in a way because it's advocating more radical changes like cosmetic surgery to change eye shape.
Yeah.
Quick question, but on your final slide, you suggest that one possible way forward might be through education. So, what I think you're talking about there is educating people about beauty.
Well, to recognise the diversity of types and to value difference rather than, you know, there is this construct of white middle class femininity and, you know, associated with beauty.
Yeah.
But, you know, I was suggesting that in the Miss India competition, I actually have a quotation that the judges making the decision are not just looking for a Miss India, they're looking for somebody who can be marketed on a global stage, and they need to look more than Indian, they have to look westernised as well.
I don't think that it is a formal education. I think it's more like raising the awareness among the community.
Yeah, awareness of
polarization of the sense of beauty, race, color.
talking about the focus groups in education there, I did have some ambitions as part of the research for teaching to maybe involve women in producing a magazine, working with students, you know, who are studying language or media, to maybe bring that about.
I just wonder about if there's a danger if you go down that road, that rather than apply some sort of a corrective to the scenario you're investigating, you might be actually inadvertently sort of compounding it, or almost
I think that was something that you were touching on.
I even find the word education a bit orientalist again.
Yeah.
But then it continues about the diversity, promotion of diversity.
Yeah. Because there is such a thing about aesthetic theory and even theory about the history of art. There is criticism about the prospect of the education of taste, or educating people about beauty, because you're essentially trying to cultivate a kind of a particular taste, and the prospect of the task of trying to do that, there's so much subjectivity involved, and so people would argue that what the education of taste or education about beauty boils down to is one person transmitting information to other people about criteria that can be appropriately applied to decisions about what is beautiful, what is not beautiful. So I think it's there's interesting problems there that might be worthwhile addressing.
You've given me something to think about. Certainly beauty is a subjective issue, and the point of the whole issue is that there's this universal conception of beauty that it's just absurd to imagine. But I think subjectivity on both sides.
Linda, did you see the Chinese washing powder advert that had to be pulled this week?
No, I didn't.
I'll bring it up when you're having a cup of tea. It's sort of related to this, and the sort of underlying racism and the whole colour dimension, and what's admired and what's not admired.
Just more to comment and kind of linking up with beauty. This is just from a personal experience, and there's beauty, and there's also things like the good girl image that we have been fit into. And I had this experience where I was in a beach with my English friend in Sri Lanka in a swimsuit, not a two-piece. But one of the guys in the beach found out that I was Sri Lankan, and he was talking, and he said, "You dress like an English girl, you should dress like a Sri Lankan girl." And I wasn't sure what this meant, and a year after that there was an event last year where Enrique Iglesias came to Sri Lanka for a concert, and the concert was called Sex and Love, and I was thinking, okay, progressively kind of talking about it, that in history, not like, and so at the concert a girl had thrown her bra on stage, and so the next day it was kind of like, the president came on TV and was like, our culture is being degraded, this Western influence is degrading our culture. And for me, in terms of trying to be free in that sort of setting, like this is where beauty and kind of giving a person a way to kind of judge could be important, because I get judged in Sri Lanka for the way I dress, for who I am, whereas it's me kind of experience trying to use my freedom, and in that kind of setting, it would be good if somebody would have appreciate that diversity in attire, and also understand that it is actually the Western influence of covering up. If you go back, like I think Marco Polo, he visited Sri Lanka in the 14th century, and he was kind of amused with all the women who were topless, and there were cartoonists saying that she's the real radical. She's saying, take your Western influence away and throwing the bra away, so that so it's kind of like you see colonialism and neocolonialism playing in the same thing, but this nationalist construct of the good girl kind of taken from that colonial.
Well, that police in women's behaviour, I gave a paper last week actually at a conference called The Novaya Who Lived, where I looked at rape, discourses of rape, from the perspective of the victim and the survivor. And it was really from a Femina article that talked about the Novaya Who Lived, a rape victim whose story hadn't been told because of her caste, and I was able to make interesting comparisons and talk about neoliberalism within India, because the text producers are absolutely right. The well-known Nabaya, Jyoti Singh, who was raped in Delhi, gang raped, the bus incident. Much of the discourse was around what was she doing out at 8:30 at night with a male. It's all around policing women's sexuality and sending a powerful message to women. This is what's going to happen to you if you adopt Western ways. That wasn't just from it gave insights into the mindset of the rapist, because a documentary called India's Daughter, which was actually banned in India, they managed to access one of the rapists in jail and interview him. So he was making those kinds of comments which you might expect, but the lawyers who represented the rapists were saying things like, if my daughter behaved like that, I'd take her to a farmhouse, pour petrol on her and set her alight.
Being honest.
One of the things that came up in my research around religious education as well was around this religious imprint, on this issue of caste, was around the religious inframing of the South Asian community, where I was going to share some data from, didn't because of time, but I was going to share some data from a Muslim majority school, Bangladeshi Muslim majority school that was part of the project. And one of the things that they talked about was the way that people didn't recognize that this issue of caste applies in the Muslim community. It's something that's discussed in reference to Hinduism because it happens because it's associated with Hindu teaching or Indian tradition in a sense, whereas because it's not specifically something that happened that's related to Islam or to Christianity, there's this lack of recognition. This is also something that happens in the Muslim community and also something that happens in the Christian community, but people aren't aware of that because
the focus is too much on the religious.
The focus is on sort of inframing the community as entirely religious in their traditions, rather than having this kind of hybrid of both tradition and religion, and that there's more. There are more things. There are more factors and influences that play in this social world than just religion.
Yeah, that's why an intersectional approach is useful, to take on all of these different aspects of identity.
That is so true, because, for instance, socialization of youth or young people is also another aspect to that, because regardless of what race they are coming from, all young women, for instance, have this common ground of being victimized by cosmetics sector, or losing weight sector, fitness sector maybe we can call it, because even a white woman can be discriminated if she's fat. And there are also so many comments or statements like that. If she was thinner, she would be prettier because she has a nice face, a beautiful face. This kind of statements. These are all issues, I think, that we should consider.
Yeah.